All right, let's get back to our guest tonight. Buff, again, thank you so much for being here. You can find Buff's website at Parry, that's PARRY.com. Thank you so much for spending a few hours with us.
And the Lewis is Louis, not Lewis.
There you go, like Jerry.
Yeah, very French.
Very
Even
French.
Though my grandfather, who gave me that name, and it was his name, was definitely not French. He chose that particular spelling for whatever reason, I guess, because that's how his name is spelled.
Well,
but onward to the
yes,
this, what I'm calling the Setuma Code.
Okay.
And we can spend some time on this, and then if we can wrap up with the salamander component or aspect to all of this, I think we will have covered all of the interrelationships between these three major topics that we set out to address.
Take off, my friend. Go ahead.
Now, we're going to start with Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, 6 years after he died, he didn't instrument this, but people discovered a lot of his writings that they were not, aware of, and they found something called Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse, which is Revelations of St. John, and it was published in 1733. It wasn't so long after that Thomas Jefferson ended up with one of the original edition copies, and his copy with his initials, his signature initials on it, was found fairly recently in the congressional record. So it has a home base in America as well as in Britain. But Isaac Newton had tried to make a connection between the Book of Daniel and Revelation. A lot of people today do that because of the identification of what is prophesied to be the circumstances at the end time or approaching the end time. But in so doing, he also wrote about the time of the emergence of the Messiah. Now, it's interesting that he focused on a chapter and verse in Genesis that has to do with the Messiah being sealed off or cut off or singled out. All those terms are used. In Torah studies and Talmudic studies, the beginning of this idea of being sealed off or cut off or singled out goes to two verses in chapter 47 that in the Hebrew scroll of the Torah, which are that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also called the Pentateuch and so on. The verses stand alone and are separated from other verses with a certain number of white spaces. The only 2 verses that flow one into the other in the Hebrew Torah scroll are in chapter 47 are verse 27 and verse 28, and I'll read them to you very, very quickly here. Verse 27 is, and Israel continued to dwell, Israel being Jacob, the same Jacob we were talking about earlier, and Israel continued to dwell in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they became settled in it and were fruitful and grew to be very many. And then 28 reads, and Jacob lived on in the land of Egypt for 17 years, so that Jacob's days, the years of his life, came to be 147 years. Now, in our King James versions and the Vulgate and all of the other versions of the Bible, other than the Hebrew, we have these numbers for chapters and verses, and it's very clear. And we wouldn't know that the original Torah has these 2 verses without any separation. We just wouldn't know it from the editions that we read generally, unless we're reading a Hebrew Torah, the Hebrew Bible. So you have to dip into the layers of the way that the Bible came out through translation into all the various editions that there are to be able to find out about this. And I want to now just read you two sentences from an article that was published in the Jerusalem Post, January 10th, 1998, and it's about the Genesis 47:28, that second verse I just read to you. And it's what it says is that Rashi, and Rashi is one of the great rabbinical scholars in terms of the Talmud and the Torah. Rashi's interpretation is not based on the words themselves, but rather on the almost hidden meaning embedded in the lack of white space between the final verse, between the end of that verse called 27 in chapter 47, and then the beginning of 48. So there's a suggestion that there's a hidden meaning, and that's extremely important, because this goes to then the way that Sir Isaac Newton and I have tried to tackle this code.
Hey, Buff, I got to stop you. I got to sync back up with my other stations. Can you just hold that thought? We'll pick you right up again. All right, our guest tonight, Lewis Buff Parry. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back on the other side. Fringe Radio, www.fringeradioshow.com. Stick around. Welcome back to Fringe Radio. Lewis Buff Parry is our guest tonight. Buff, before we pick back up again, I've got two things to throw out at you, okay?
Okay.
First thing is we got a few calls while we were on hold. One lady, well, nothing but compliments. They didn't want to stop you. I asked them if they wanted to come on the air. They said no, because they want you to keep going. The one lady asked do you have any, are there any, and I forgot to ask you this, do you have any books, writings? People are very interested in your work and about you. Of course, they know what your website is. Do you have anything published out there that people can purchase?
Yeah, you'll find if they go to the website, they'll find some articles. There are two that pertain to a lot of what we're talking about in a periodical called ESOP, ESOP. I'm recently in a number of books. I've got several manuscripts. I haven't had a moment to really try to publish something that is completely only mine. I've ended up in everybody else's publications writing essays and various articles. So I don't have there's not a single book under my name as the author, but there are scores of books that I have contributed to or that are about my work. Okay. So I think going to the website probably would be the best place to go. The best way to answer that right now.
Okay. Second question for you is this before we get back. Would you be willing to do another hour tonight?
Tonight?
Yeah. I've got the fourth hour open. Would you be willing to...
Really? Okay. Yeah. Why not? Why not? Then I can slow down now. My heart will...
Okay, so pull the throttles back a little bit, because there's a lot of stuff we want to talk about, and I had the last hour open, but it would be great to get you. It would be great to have you, and we've got a couple calls stacked up too. You want to take a call real quick?
Okay.
Okay, let's do that, and then we'll get back. Caller, good evening. Welcome to Fringe Radio. You're on with Buff Parry.
Yes. Are you talking to me?
Yes, I am. Go ahead. You're on with Buff.
Does your guest have any knowledge about what is called the Philadelphia experiment?
Philadelphia experiment, Buff. What about that?
I've heard this term, this phrase used. It seems to me I knew what that was in the past. Jog my memory a little bit.
Well,
go ahead.
No, if you know anything about it, you go ahead and question him.
Yeah, well, it was just, of course, there was a couple of movies made. There was talk about time travel, interdimensional travel aboard the ship in Philadelphia Harbor, where they ran some sort of an experiment. I've seen the fictional. I've read the fictional side. I think there's definitely more than fiction to it, but just didn't know if you knew.
Actually, no, I don't. Okay. But now I'm going to look into it.
He'll look into it for you.
Let me just say this. I think that would be a wonderful show sometime. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you. Take care, my friend. Okay, Buff, go ahead. Let's pick.
Okay, there's no more callers?
No more callers. Go ahead.
Okay. So back to this Bible code that Newton felt he had discovered, and here's more on Newton's approach, and then we'll get into what I have found, and people can draw their own conclusions about who hit the nail on the head. So it's 6 years after Sir Isaac Newton died in 1727, when his work titled Observations Upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse or Revelations of St. John was published by Darby and Brown, 1733. Chapter 10 of that book is titled Of the Prophecy of the 70 Weeks. And here's where his prophecy about the Messiah emerges.
Okay.
So let's look at this, and instead of going to Revelation, which is what he did, I'm going to take you to Genesis and show you a very startling set of parallels that just, to me, are mind-boggling, considering what we're supposed to believe happened, in terms of how the Bible came together and the chronology of the books, one succeeding the next, and all of that. So if we go to Genesis 49:24, and that's not to forget this Setuma issue that we touched on earlier from chapter 47, verse 27 and 28, that there's the belief that something was sealed off. There was information, knowledge about something very, very important that was taken out, sealed off, and my view of that is, well, if that's the case, then we're probably going to find it somewhere later. So keeping that in mind, going to chapter 49 of Genesis, Genesis 24, 25, and 26, our counterpart, interestingly, to in Daniel chapter 9, 24, 25, and 26. That alone is not a coincidence. When we get to the Setuma verse in each, which is chapter 49, 26 in Genesis, and chapter 9, 26 in Daniel. So here's how chapter 49, 24 reads in Genesis. Joseph is the shepherd and the stone of Israel. Well, go to Daniel 9:24. There's no 49, so it's 9:24. Virtually the same numbers as those I just cited from Genesis. And what does it state? It says Gabriel tells Daniel of the 70 weeks for the seal of the prophet and anointment of the Holy of Holies, which is the inner sanctum of the temple. So the word prophet is used here in relation to some 70 weeks, and this is what Isaac Newton got fixed on. But in the counterpart to it in Genesis, the word prophet's not used. The actual person is Joseph, the shepherd and the stone of Israel. So let's go to the next verse right after that in Genesis. Joseph, endowed with the blessings of God from above, of the watery deep lying down below, and of the breasts and womb. So 9:25 in Daniel, which has the same numbers, 49:25 in Genesis, 9:25 in Daniel.
Right.
This is the first use of the word Messiah in the entire Old Testament, and it's only used twice in the entire Old Testament. The word Messiah is not used otherwise. But here, this is Daniel introducing the word Messiah. So the Messiah word is introduced for the first time, replacing the prophet word that we just cited, in 9:24, the previous verse in Daniel, where it says, again, Gabriel tells Daniel of the 70 weeks for the seal of the prophet and anointment of the Holy of Holies. So 9:25 in Daniel, the next verse is the Messiah word, first introduced, and it is said that he must rebuild Jerusalem 7 weeks and 62 weeks with a public square and a moat. Keep that in mind. Keep the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks in mind, that number. Right. Let's go now to the next set of complementary verses that have all the same numbers. And these are the ones I call the Setuma verses. In chapter 49:26 of Genesis, it says, the blessings will continue upon the head of Joseph, upon the crown of the head of the one cut off, singled out, sealed off from his brothers. That's Setuma. Remember back in those verses at 27 and 28, in chapter 47, when Setuma first emerges, it becomes a constant preoccupation of rabbis all over the world. Here we have it in reference to Joseph being singled out, sealed off, and cut off from his brothers. So 9:26 in Daniel says, after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off with nothing for himself. Now this coincidence is getting, bizarre. It is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that these line up so perfectly with each other, and they have the same verse numbers and almost the same chapter numbers. It's just that Daniel doesn't go much past chapter 9, but it has 49 in terms of the chapter number in Genesis and 9 in Daniel. Okay, so that's the Setuma chapter. Then finally, and this one is kind of a key, we have 49:27. So here we have 24, 25, 26, 27 in both cases, in Daniel and Genesis. In Genesis, it says, Joseph's only brother from Rachel, Benjamin, will keep on tearing like a wolf. In the morning, he will eat the animal seized, and at evening, he will divide the spoil. So what do we have in Daniel? 9:27, same number. He must keep the covenant in force for the many for 1 week, halfway into which he will cease sacrifice. He will cause sacrifice and gift offering to cease. Well, Jesus is recognized as the prophet Messiah who stopped animal sacrifice. He became the Lamb of God. He became the sacrificial entity.
Right.
In that process of sacrificing. And animal sacrifice stopped. It still continues clearly in Islam, but Christians don't do it. Okay. What does this mean to Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest physicist who ever lived? Add up these numbers in these consecutive verses. First, it starts with 70 weeks for the seal of the prophet and anointment of the Holy of Holies. So there's 70 weeks right there. Then we have the Messiah word being introduced, and he must rebuild Jerusalem 7 weeks and 62 weeks with the public square. Okay, that's 69 weeks now, right?
Right.
And then we go to 9:26, and it says, after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off with nothing for himself. Then the next verse adds 1 more week. He must keep the covenant in force for the many for 1 week, halfway into which he will cause sacrifice and gift offering to cease. So that those numbers added up. 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week give us 70 again. So we've got 70 weeks twice given.
Right.
And of course, 70 times 70 is 4,900. That's 49, right?
Right.
The three lead-up verses that are identical in number to those 3 from Daniel are all in chapter 49.
Amazing.
This is not a coincidence, and clearly Sir Isaac Newton didn't think it was, because he then suggests that the first coming of Jesus is all about what has to do with the 62 weeks, and then the second coming has to do with, what does that say again? 9:27, that halfway into which he will cause sacrifice and gift offering to cease. That is what we're to believe Jesus did. But this is Daniel in the Old Testament, not New Testament.
Right.
So that's part of the code. Now let's get into the real nitty-gritty of this Setuma stuff, because that starts from the Hebrew Bible in chapter 47, not 49. Important to remember that 3 times 49 is 147.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So let's look at this. Genesis 47, verse 28 has 2 other numbers, 17 and 147, right? And then Daniel in chapter 12, verse 4 and 7 matches, because in the Hebrew tradition, this section is called the 12th portion. So we have the 12th portion, and chapter 47 and verse 28 with the other numbers. And in Daniel, we have 12, 4, and 7. So what does Daniel say? Daniel, make secret the words and seal up the book. It will be for an appointed time. So we have now another sealing off, another closing off. That is the Setuma. This is this is what moved Isaac Newton a lot and moves me deeply, if for no other reason than the complexity of this encipherment. It's stunning. But let's go a little further. The number 17, right? That's how many years that Jacob was sealed off in Egypt and couldn't go back to the Holy Land. So we have Jacob, Israel, sealed off from his home for 17 years, and then he dies at 147 of age. Well, okay, in the New Testament, we've got John the Baptist, who comes in eating cicadas. They're called locusts usually, but they're the locust cicadas. And honey from the desert. He had taken the Nazirite vow, which Moses outlined. The cicadas go into the ground for 17-year cycles.
Right.
It's unbelievable. They are sealed off, in other words, for 17 years. Then they emerge out of the ground, and cicadas swarm, and
which
they're
they
all
still
kinds of
do to this day.
Exactly, every 17 years.
Right.
Okay, so that covers the 17 years. Jacob, Israel, sealed off from his home for 17 years in that chapter 47, verse 28. Now, what about the number 147? The age of Jacob, Israel, when he died, is 3 times 49, 147. The three key verses Isaac Newton uses to predict the Messiah are Daniel 9, 24, 25, and 26. Their counterparts in Genesis are 49, 24, 49, 25, and 49, 26. 3 times 49 is 147, which is the year that Jacob reached before he died. So then let's go to chapter 9, 24, 26. Twice the number 70 is arrived at, so 70 times 70 is 4,900. Just to repeat that, 70 that is the key to this whole Newton Bible code is 490 days. It just repeats itself over and over and over again. So with with Isaac Newton's decoding, that brought his calculation to 1967. And in Israel, a huge to-do was made about this. There was a great big giant display at Hebrew University to celebrate all of this, because many believed that this was the year of the emergence of the Messiah. Why that year? What made them think that? The War of 67. Israel stood against and defeated every Arab neighbor
Buff,
that had declared war.
I got to take a break. I'll let you grab a little quick something to drink. Our guest tonight,
Are you noticing that?
Buff Parry. Yes, go ahead. We'll take a little break and we'll be right back. Fringe Radio, www.fringeradioshow.com. We'll be back on the other side. Sticker. All right, everybody, welcome back to Fringe Radio with Buff Parry. Yeah, I could tell you needed a little bit of a drink there, Buff.
Well, I've got a whole glass now right by my side.
All right, go ahead, my friend. Put it back.
Okay,
it's just blowing.
Pardon?
I'm scratching this down on paper. This is it kind of blows you away.
Well, I'm glad to perform that service, I'll tell you.
You are, without a doubt.
Okay. Just to refresh, we've got Isaac Newton writing this book. Again, it's titled Observations Upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse, or Revelations, of St. John, and published in 1733. And it's about chapter 10 that all this has to do with, and it's titled Of the Prophecy of the 70 Weeks. Now, we just went through two 70-week series of verses. So,
okay.
And this is where the Messiah emerges in his calculation, and he's got it through we won't get into the details of the mathematics of it all once you get into these, 70 weeks times 70 weeks and so forth. But the Messiah emerges in his calculation in 1967. So the Israelis, who aren't generally Christian, kind of flipped out about this one, because here's the greatest physicist on earth coming from a Christian perspective, yes, talking about a second coming, and to people who practice Judaism, it would still be the first coming of the Davidic Messiah, given that the suffering Messiah has already come, although most people who practice Judaism don't accept that, Jesus was even the suffering Messiah. They do accept he was a rabbi and some that he was a prophet, but not the Messiah. I accept he was the suffering Messiah. Every verse that describes how the suffering Messiah lives and what happens to him is, he fulfilled it. He fulfilled all of those. Now, coming a second time to then fulfill the other set of verses that are prophecies about the Davidic Messiah, that's another matter. Mm-hmm. So Isaac Newton and I split company there. He has Jesus coming back a second time, and that's the second part of his prophecy. So from an Israeli, Jewish, Judaic point of view, to have the War of 67 won by Israel when every nation in their neighborhood opposed them is to Messianic Jews a sign that the Messiah is here. My calculation, and by the way, I'm not saying I believe or don't believe this. I'm saying that there is a code and there's a way to calculate to get to the dates that are embedded and hidden. In my calculation, it's 2022, but that's awfully close to 1967 over the long span of time. It's only a 55-year or so difference mm-hmm. between the two, and the problem is, in my opinion, of Isaac Newton. He goes forward to Revelation, which is lifted right out of Daniel anyway. I go to the first book, Genesis, and find that Daniel is lifted from Genesis rather than, going to the argument that Revelation is lifted from Daniel. So my calculation, which is something that would take hours, we just can't get into that tonight. But okay. My calculation has it at 2022, and Isaac Newton's was 1967, and virtually the nation of Israel supported it, celebrated his this book of his with especially chapter 10 of the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and showcased it at Hebrew University. We'll see. I haven't noted there being a Messiah around since 1967, so I'd say that interpretation and then conclusion as a prophecy is not altogether correct, but it's so close, 55 years from what I had concluded, which was 2022.
Okay.
So that's the biblical, what I call the Setuma Code, and in terms of Sir Isaac Newton, it's referred to as the Messiah Code, or the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Now, you want to get into the critter?
Could I put a few questions out there that were emailed into me?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now we're not going to talk necessarily about Da Vinci, but this was just just some general questions that maybe you could answer. One of our listeners writes in and says, during Da Vinci's lifetime, witches were quite prevalent back then. Witchcraft was being practiced. Witches were being executed. Do you have any? Can you talk as far as? And maybe we're off topic on this, Buff, but possibly Da Vinci and the connection of of witchcraft and some of these unique things. Was he connected with any of that, and maybe a little bit of how if at all, if you've studied that or looked into how witches were their roles and some of the things that happened to them during his time period.
To boil that down, the question is really, was Leonardo da Vinci practicing mantic arts? Was he dabbling in, the so-called dark arts, which in my understanding, really weren't dark at all? Alchemy gave birth to chemistry. The very word alchemy is Arabic, alchemia, it comes from, which means the chemistry. So if I were teaching a chemistry course in Arabic, I would say alchemy, but it wouldn't mean the same thing it means in English. Mm-hmm. It just means chemistry, the chemistry, alchemia. And, as far as astronomy and astrology are concerned, that's a little more, out on the edge than the alchemy to chemistry transition that is what the Renaissance and the Age of Reason and, those great ages that came from the Renaissance are all about. But no, I don't think Leonardo da Vinci was at all practicing mantic arts of any kind, in any manner of speaking. He kind of had a cynical view of them and looked down on them. He did have some fanciful fables that he wrote about animals and things like that, but no, I would say no. He wasn't interested in witchcraft, but there were people around him who were, and we know what happened to them in the colonies, and the sort of coeval timing on both sides of the Atlantic was such that similar things were happening to those who were practicing witchcraft in Europe. But I think there's an awful lot of misunderstanding about all of that. Natural religions, get lopped into these categories of things like witchcraft. Shamanism of indigenous peoples of the world is not witchcraft. But if you don't know the difference and you haven't looked into it, people will categorize things like shamanism and animism as witchcraft. Again, in my opinion, all of that is about is concentrated expressions of the one God. So animism, really in a pure kind of sense, not a mantic art sense, animism becomes a system of identifying where God seems to be expressing God's self more in a concentrated way than in other places. Okay. And shamanism, what is shamanism? I think, honestly, all the prophets were shamans in some degree or other. All the saints. What do we celebrate them? For the most. It's Francis, for example. What do he do? The wolves of Gubbio, Italy, were dragging little children out of the village of Gubbio and eating them. Francis goes and lives with the wolves to stop them from, doing that to the children of Gubbio. He talks to the birds, Francis. He engages what in indigenous traditions would be, not idolatry, not worshiping animals as God, but he engages at a deeper level, the communication systems that exist in nature, as best he could in the time that he lived. So I'm a little bit averse to drawing quick conclusions about who's a witch and who's practicing mantic arts and who isn't by just observing something that they may be doing, when no one's being hurt or anything, just by observing what they're doing, and then labeling or categorizing them as this or as that. Leonardo da Vinci, when one reads all of what he wrote, really was anti-mantic art. He was not into it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I know that at that time, during when I've done a little bit of research about witches and some of those practices, and he's come up several times. Basically, I think it's because of the time period. But it was a heavy time period. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of witchcraft being in black, dark things, dark arts were being practiced back then.
No doubt. Today they're being practiced.
Yeah.
There's Satanism abounds. There's all kinds of dark arts that are going on as we speak. But they shouldn't be confused with some behaviorisms that if you don't understand what they are, and if nobody's being hurt in the process, that shouldn't be automatically considered, dark arts or mantic arts. And I assure you, Leonardo did not practice mantic arts. He wasn't casting spells. He wasn't trying to raise the dead. He wasn't doing all of those things that even some secret societies today claim, to practice.
Exactly. Were people during his time period? Were there people that thought he was a crackpot? Were there people that were people think he was crazy? Were there people that looked up to him and praised him? I mean, what did people of the period think?
Oh, he was in demand. He had gained a reputation, that went across Europe for sure, and into the East to some extent. His patrons were Duke of Milan and the Medicis, and never the Pope. He never really worked with the Pope like Michelangelo did. But he died. Some say, in the arms of King Francis I of France, and they were very close. King Francis became like his student in Leonardo's last year as he moved to France. And he was given a lovely place, and that was where he did a lot of his robot stuff, where he had animated characters that he'd take on parades through towns and show on stages and things like that. He got into the more fun and childlike creativity towards his last years, but I'm answering your question in a roundabout way.
No, it's fine.
Anybody who was considered a crackpot wouldn't have had those kinds of patrons, and they vied for his attention, for being able to patronize him. It was an honor to have Leonardo, salaried, so to speak. So I think he was exceptional, and everybody, saw him as very unique. And of course, some people would have thought he was strange and maybe a crackpot, considering the kinds of things that he was producing, that operated on their own, so yeah. But to this day, people are considered crackpots who are intensely creative and gifted, and can do more than 2 or 3 things in terms of skill sets. Things haven't changed that much. I think exceptional people end up kind of in the same situation, whatever generation we're talking about or whatever age we're talking about. And we're in one now where gifted, exceptional people frequently are. Look at what happened to Alan Turing. I mean, the man who invented the machine that broke the code of the Nazis with the their Enigma machine. Right. Look what happened to him. He committed suicide. He got hounded for being so, unique, for being so offbeat and exceptional. So it runs into our age. It runs, and I think it's going to continue. It's just a lot in life that exceptional people have, and the better that they can deal with normal, average humans, the better, and exceptional people should make every effort to try to take the smoke and mirrors away that separates them from the common man.
Again, just an amazing individual. When I did my little bit of nowhere near what you've done, I haven't even scratched the surface. But just amazing as I went through and looked at Wikipedia and some of these sites that gave an overview of his life. We've got to take a final news break, Buff, and then we'll let you get a break for a few minutes, and then we'll come back on the other side and talk about the salamander.
Sure enough.
All right, our guest.
You mean the seraphim?
The seraphim, yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Our guest tonight, Lewis.
No, you're right. Salamander, but the seraphim are salamanders. You'll hear that.
All right, we'll do it. Our guest tonight, Lewis Buff Parry. We'll be back on the other side.